realize how much Putin and Putin's people might be driven by fear. Not of NATO, not of the EU, of a free Ukraine.
So this is Joe Lindsley talking to you from Lviv, Ukraine.
Hey, this is Andrew Fink. I'm in Talinn, Estonia.
Hello, this is Joe Lindsley talking to you from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. I'm currently here on a cross-country train trip from the city of Lviv, where I have lived the past 2 years in pandemic exile. It's very close to the Polish border. And with my colleague Vitaly Holich, we are traveling on a reporting trip to Kyiv, a city, the second city of Ukraine with 1.4 million people and just about 20 miles from the Russian border. And we want to know the mood of this country, especially those who live near Russia. And that's our mission to share it with you. But for now, in this episode of the Real Ukraine podcast, I speak with my friend Andrew Fink. Andrew lived in Kyiv for at least 6 years. He knows the city incredibly well. He came here he was working on his dissertation for his doctorate at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and he was studying Soviet and Russian propaganda and conspiracy theories. In the course of his time here, I think he's one of the best experts on Russia, on the mind of Vladimir Putin, insofar as anyone can possibly know, and on how history and geopolitics factors together in the current strife and the current tension between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the world. And so here I speak with Dr. Fink, and I hope you'll get some insights out of this conversation, and know that you are speaking to, I would say, Fink is the guy who, in the James Bond movies, James Bond arrives at the airport, and the guy on the ground who he meets, who knows all the information about the city, anything you could possibly imagine, that's Fink. And so this is the guy to listen to attempt to get a better understanding of this crazy situation that we're in. Thank you. All right, well, Fink, Andrew, I call you Fink because we're old friends, it's thanks to you I first came to Ukraine, because you were living in Kyiv you were there for 6 years, right?
6 years.
Yeah.
Too short.
And I think I was in Budapest, and I flew to Kyiv summer 2018 or so, and thought it was an amazing place. And then
I tried to, I took you to Kyiv, and then I tried to sell you on Odessa, which is my favorite corner. And then, as an afterthought, I decided to take you out to Lviv, and you haven't left since. So I think you made your choice.
That was it was more than two. I mean, the first time, yeah. When I was hiding out in Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains.
Oh, right.
When the TV show came out, The Loudest Voice, and then you and our friends, the Sharon brothers, we traveled to Lviv, Ukrainian Independence Day, 2019, and. And then at that point, I no longer loved Kyiv. I thought Lviv was, I like Kyiv a lot, but I was very happy here. And now I came back here in February 2020, and I'm still here because they closed the borders, and then I decided not to leave. And now I think I'm meant to be here during this time. And in the interim, I was best man at your wedding in September.
That's right.
Was it September 2021? Sometime in the
September of 2020, the pre-lockdown wedding. Like, really quick, I need a best man. Joe will help me.
I was the backup best man due to the lockdown situation, but it was an honor, and the wedding was on an island in the Dnipro, on a beautiful summer evening, and you could see that was the Lavra, the cave monastery that we could see right on the cliffs and the hills above us, and I remember there were so many interesting people there, and I thought, so many people who worked for, whether it's USAID or, or Ukrainians and nonprofits. And and people working to keep this country free and make it more prosperous. So many of them were there at that wedding. It was really an amazing group of people, and I remember we had a couple conversations, saying, "Wow, we're in this beautiful city, in this island, in the river, in this moment of peace." But even then, there was this like the little sense of Mordor or doom lurking. How long will this last? And some people I spoke to there said they had plans, were already buying houses or property in Lviv, here far in the west, which is only 70 kilometers from Poland. So even then, over a year ago, there was that sense of doom. But you're in your, and we should also mention you're a PhD.
Yes, that's why I was in Ukraine, doing research
on Russian and Soviet propaganda, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of it. It was sort of bigger on the history of the use of conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns, but the Soviet piece was a big part of that.
Because you went back to the protocols of the elders.
Oh yeah, I went all the way back to the French Revolution, dude.
Wow. Yeah.
But if we're talking about that, we'll be here all night.
Well, I do want to see this in a book soon, and
I'm working on it.
And your PhD was from I always say it wrong, but yeah,
University of Leiden, just south of Amsterdam. Yeah.
And now you're in Talinn, Estonia, and yes. You and your wife. And so, man, in all of our conversations in Kyiv, because of the nature of what you were studying and conspiracy theories from all different regions of the world, but with a focus on Russia, you've also, I think, understood a good amount. Insofar as we can understand Putin, more than most because you've studied and paid attention. What can you say? And one big question I think a lot of Americans have is what is Putin after? What is his motivation? Russia's the biggest country in the world. Is it land that he needs? It doesn't seem so. What is he trying to do? Is it he had a bad childhood? What's
Well, first of all, I don't really know. I just have my informed opinion of, I lived in Russia long ago. I've been watching it for over a decade. I've been obsessed with Russian propaganda since the Georgia War of 2008, when I was practicing Russian, watching the Russian news, and I watched them prepare the info space for their surprise invasion of Georgia 2 months later in August. Since then, I've been watching it very closely.
Can we pause on that real quick?
Sure.
Maybe I was talking with some Georgians today, and we did a couple stories, but and I think it's very relevant to this time right now. What were they doing in these 2 months, to prepare the info space? One of the Georgians we spoke with, said there wasn't the same, especially in Georgia in 2008, the same usage of social media. So people weren't as aware of everything in the minute as we are now. What was Russia doing in those 2 months before the invasion?
It even goes back longer. So this sort of bad blood, if you will, between Russia and Georgia publicly, I started seeing as early as 2006, right before the war in Georgia. And I wish I had time to look at my notes and really prepare this. You saw a movement of a lot of Russian news reporters down to North Ossetia and also South Ossetia, like sort of getting ready, a lot more talk about the crisis that is coming. And Abkhazia, which is another sort of Russia-supported quasi-republic there in Georgia, they were, in the weeks before the war broke out, talking about how they were getting ready for a fight too. And this was all sort of, and one more thing. This is not so much in terms of a press thing, but I guess it is propaganda. There was a Russian exercise, large Russian military exercise right before the event. And I think this probably contributed to the surprise because people didn't see, units sort of suddenly move down there. The units were already down there. The tanks were already down there. The ammunition was already down there. And then the Russians could basically start from, it looks like they were standing still.
This was, what was it called? The Caucasus?
Kavkaz, yeah, the Kavkaz exercise, which is annual, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe that could be a future discussion, go more into the situation with Georgia, but from there, do we look at what do you think has been happening here in that sense?
Well, with Ukraine, you got to go back at least to 2014 to the events of the Revolution of Dignity, or as I and a lot of other English speakers usually just call it the Maidan Revolution. when you had this corrupt pro-Russian president in Ukraine who used this crisis of suddenly changing his campaign promises to have an association agreement with the EU. This created a political crisis, a lot of protests, cracked down on the protests, and then he tried to use this crisis, it seems, to become a dictator. I think the dictatorship laws of January 2014 are not spoken about enough, as he outlawed freedom of assembly, made certain restrictions on driving and what people can do politically. They rammed this through a Ukrainian parliament that did not have a quorum, and that I think is, an important event that I think spelled his doom in retrospect, because even a lot of Ukrainian leaders who might have been relatively for what he represented thought that was too far. And we forget.
And too far, specifically, what was
breaking the rules of the game? Basically shutting down proposing to shut down Ukrainian democracy. Ukrainian democracy is all sorts of warts, and it's still moving, still getting better, but it is a legitimate democracy, and you even have different centers of power, different influence groups that he managed to alienate basically all of them. And we forget that after he fled in 2014, when the protests got really bad in February, his own party, the Party of the Regions, kicked him out of the party. That was in the heady days right before the invasion of Crimea, when everyone thought the crisis was over for a few weeks.
Well, and as I ask questions about this, steer me, out if you think I'm going down the wrong sort of path for this current conversation. But and maybe this is simply a note for future conversations. But there is talk among critics of how do you put it? But I say some Americans now who think that maybe the administration, and we're not going to go into that, but are pushing for war. But okay, maybe this is something we won't talk about. But they
no, please.
That the Euromaidan was a U.S. orchestrated color revolution and not something from the people of Ukraine. Can you respond to that?
I think at no point in his entire presidency did Barack Obama ever wake up in the morning and think, you know what? Today I want to spend more time on Eastern Europe. That just never happened. This rings true both with what I observed at the time and my subsequent speaking with a lot of people who were involved in this. This was an indigenous Ukrainian movement, kind of a bit of a surprise for the Americans and for the West generally, actually. And also, I'll remind you that sort of the last stage before Yanukovych fled, a lot of European diplomats were urging Ukrainian activists to make a deal, to come to an accommodation with Yanukovych. So even the West, it was not united. It was not necessarily in favor of taking the path that it took. The Yanukovych's exit, at least from my standpoint, was pretty surprising and pretty sudden. And then what are you supposed to do when you're the president, who's already embroiled in scandal and tried to become a dictator, just leaves and takes off and goes to a different country? What do you do?
Well, and I want to get your sense on what you thought Putin thought in that moment, and because it seems that, and I'm speaking with so many Ukrainians these past 2 years here, also speaking with friends in Hong Kong, many of whom have escaped Hong Kong, friends from Belarus. The impact for those people of Euromaidan, of the revolution of dictator, is amazing. I mean, people in Hong Kong, they used to wave the American flag, the British flag, and the Ukrainian flag before the government forbade protest in 2019. Euromaidan showed people in Belarus tried to get something like it recently. Sometimes I even see this in these, the countries in Europe that have the massive COVID restriction protest. Here, we don't see that now because the government knows it can only push people so far because of that memory of Euromaidan. And there's like this basic element of democracy, that power that gave to the people. And
Ukrainian civil society really flexed its muscles there, and hopefully the Ukrainian politicians will never forget it.
Does a power like that sort of disturb other regimes around the world, both because of the way it can and so what do you make of that?
And there it is. There it is. Yes, as you know, I think that's the core reason for Putin's invasion of Donbass. I think he took Crimea starting in February of 2014 because it was a moment of extreme Ukrainian weakness. But Donbass, that really kicked off in April, several months later, is different. The talk among Russian propagandists was to, quote, federalize Ukraine. And you already started to see then this idea that the Ukrainian government was not legitimate. And not just not legitimate, it was actually a project of the West, of America. Even sometimes you have, the Zionists coming up and some of the more rambunctious folks, out there on VKontakte. You have this idea that Ukraine is not a democracy at all. It is actually under the control of foreign powers. And this works out really great for Putin and his ilk, because if this is true, then they don't have to, they don't have to worry about accommodating their own people. They are the guardians of Russia against this evil conspiratorial tide that has now taken control of Ukraine, just as it has taken control of other countries in Europe.
You're saying it gets Putin off the hook a little bit on domestic policy, and
well, not just domestic policy. It's an old trick, and this is part of what my thesis was about. If it's difficult for people to argue against things that are so good, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, not having some jerk come and take all your stuff because he's the relative of the president. This is a tough thing to defend a system that allows this to happen against a new system, against a more liberal, more westernized system that will cut down on this. And the way propagandists time and again have sort of gotten around this is by saying, aha, don't you realize they're lying. That's not actually a vote. It's not actually democracy. Actually, this is part of a project that is under the control of, some evil power. The original one I talked about, it was the Freemasons and the Illuminati who were blamed for the French Revolution. But it's had many guises. You have anti-Jesuit conspiracy theories say something similar. That was the Russia line during the Polish revolt of 1863, where you had a very sudden uprising of Polish nationalists and liberals all across the area of what is today Belarus and Poland and Ukraine. And the official Russian response was, don't you realize, these guys are only saying they're Polish nationalists and they want freedom and stuff. Really, they're under control of the Jesuits. And it's really a giant Jesuit project to destroy Russia. And of course, the biggest one, is the Jewish conspiracy theories. But what we're dealing with here in Ukraine, I think, is a variant of sort of Soviet conspiracy theories. That they said that all countries in the West, all countries that are liberal and democratic, are actually under the control of sort of financial elites. And the smaller countries that are under their protection or with them, like Ukraine, are actually under the control of sort of the appendages of this banker-controlled government of the United States. We're talking here about the CIA and MI6 and the IMF and the European Union. That these are all instruments that these shadowy people use to take over countries while making it look like they're actually liberalizing, becoming more democratic.
And if you just saw, to spend even a few weeks there and saw like in what I would call sort of the glorious chaos of Ukrainian life, there's no evidence, there's no indication of any control anywhere. I mean, even down to the level of interactions with police officers. If you get pulled over while driving in America, you're afraid of getting shot. Here, the officer is almost apologetic because there's the people will challenge power at every level, and so I see the total I see no way that could be.
Well, I think, Joe, well, you should spend more time in Kyiv and in Odessa, where you get sort of this more of this suspicion among a lot of elites and demi-elites that, there's some sort of game going on that they're not part of, or there's some room somewhere, who's the guy at the US embassy who really makes all the choices about Ukraine's fiscal policy. Now, and I know it, the State Department is not half as competent as these people give them credit for, much less malign. But this, once again, I suspect this is the long tail of Soviet propaganda that was fed for 70 years. But
I once had a secret lunch with someone who'd been right hand or some high up, advisor to Soros, and and he and Soros used to sit and talk about my old boss Roger is like evil epicenter, and we would do the same, obviously, for them. And yeah,
let me tell you, I want to listen to that podcast.
Yeah, well, yeah, we should, but I'm the only one who's free to talk because I didn't sign papers. Unfortunately,
but as you know, George Soros is one of the major boogeymen for both anti-Western and Russian propaganda in Ukraine. They're sort of the Soros people. So he does have an NGO, Open Societies Foundation. They do make grants to a bunch of organizations in Ukraine because that's what he does. That's his version of philanthropy. But according to some of these people, it's Soros is everywhere. Soros is the one who's controlling the Ukrainian currency. Soros is doing this. Soros is doing that. I got to tell you, I don't think. Forget about how malign Soros is. I don't think he has the capacity.
Yeah, or even the interest, maybe.
Yes.
So why did in 2014? And this is another thing that gets missed now. Is, Ukraine. It was the regime fled, and everything was not quite built from scratch, but it was they had to get a new government. The military was sort of in tatters. A lot of pro-Russian people, were either removed or fled from the military, and then Russia moves in. So very swiftly, Crimea was taken, and then Russia is funding separatist fighters in the eastern region of Donbass. But I think they were making efforts to go for the cities of Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and the only reason they didn't, they tried, it seems, to orchestrate rebellions in those cities, but the civilians and the citizens prevented that. That's my impression of it. What really happened in 2014? Was Putin simply content having Donbass, or was he going for gold and going to get Kyiv?
I think he was going to federalize Ukraine. That's the word that they used back then, federalize. By that they meant break Ukraine into 3 or 4 or 5 sort of manageable pieces that can be manipulated individually. So you could have basically a very weak Kyiv central government, but a very strong government, pro-Russian, in Donetsk and Luhansk and Kharkiv and Odessa, and probably some sort of more pro-Western thing going on in Lviv, but it'd be a much more manageable problem for him. So federalization was the initial line. Then you had this Novorossiya project, which lasted for about a year and a half, where they started talking about turning southern eastern Ukraine into their own independent country of Novorossiya, which would stand against the sort of the more nationalist Ukrainian speaking parts of Ukraine, as they said. Now that petered out, really, I think, because of Ukrainian battlefield success. And we should talk about a bit, the course of the war. It wasn't just funding that the Russians gave these so-called separatists. I actually very early stopped calling them separatists and started calling them Russian irregulars. I think it's pretty obvious from some videos I've seen and from some reporting I've gotten that there were Russian special forces involved in this very early on, both doing some of the dirty work and help setting up these groups and getting these militias together. These tanks that showed up, especially after the fall of Slavyansk in the midsummer of 2014, suddenly you had all these supposed volunteers, factory workers and miners who just knew how to drive tanks, and also they knew how to shoot artillery, and they had they never ran out of ammunition. And of course, starting with the Battle of Ilovaisk, you had the intervention of actual Russian units into Ukraine.
This is in what point in 2014?
I'll have to check my notes, but we're talking here about the later summer of 2014.
Was it Moscow that said, okay, we have enough of the territory that we want for now. We just wanted this part of Donbass. Or, I mean, I know there were agitations, for example, in Odessa and Kharkiv. There was a 2-day rebellion in Kharkiv. But
well, let's get to
what was it? What stopped that? Or who chose to stop?
Well, who chose to stop it? I mean, I think some Ukrainians with guns.
And but these were not they were not in the army. These were just civilians and
well,
citizens,
some of them were. No, I think we need to give the Ukrainian army some credit at getting its act together, at least by the summer. There were some of these so-called volunteer battalions and National Guard units. However, there's a big debate among Ukrainians about who exactly did what, who was the better. I'm sure there's intramural arguing. I actually wasn't in Ukraine at this time, so I don't feel like I can comment about this. I've only been out to near the line of contact once, so I'm actually not really a Donbass guy. But let's get to the heart of this. I don't think that Putin was after territory. He was after federalizing Ukraine, which would mean the end of the revolution, turning Ukraine into something, returning it to a manageable satrapy of his empire. Because now here's where we get a little bit of a question. Does Putin really believe Russian propaganda about how the revolution of Maidan is a Western project, or is he acting from sort of much more selfish interests that he doesn't want the Russians to get ideas that they can kick out corrupt dictators and have their free election? Can I tell the joke now?
A Fink joke, as I call it, which maybe whether you came up with it yourself or it's something you've unearthed from history. The key is you have to listen very carefully, and it's going to seem like, where the hell is this going? But it actually will lead to an amazing deep insight about the reality of the situation we're talking about. So listen to this joke very carefully.
So the story goes, after the collapse of communism, the Siloviki, the big bosses, who controlled the security force of the Soviet Union, they had a period of uncertainty, but eventually they took power in Russia. But they weren't too worried about the Russian people, because they could say, hey, look, Russia, you need people like us, because you can't have a Western democracy in a post-communist country. It just results in chaos. It all breaks down. Well, then Poland happened. And they said, okay, well, Poland, though, okay, that's communist. Oh, fine, it was communist, but it's not Soviet. And you can't have a Western democracy in a post-Soviet country, so you still need us. But then Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia happened. And then they said, well, those guys, they're basically Germans. They're Catholic or Protestant backgrounds. It's very different for us. So you still need us, because you can't have a Western democracy in a post-Soviet Orthodox country. Well, then Georgia started to happen. And they said, okay, well, Georgia, it's very small, very tiny country, and maybe there you could have some sort of Western democracy, but you can't have a Western democracy in a large post-Soviet Orthodox country. So when Ukraine started to happen, if it happens, if it works out, if Ukraine is a success, these people like Putin will have to tell tell Russians, hey, look, maybe it worked in Ukraine, but it still stands that you can't have a Western democracy in a large post-Soviet Orthodox country that begins with the letter R. It's just not possible.
That would be that, because Ukraine is similar enough to Russia culturally that would be that's all Putin could come up with.
So this cultural similarity, these common cultural roots between Russia and Ukraine, is something that Russian propagandists always harp on, to say, this is why we need to be together. Putin released an essay in the summer all about the deep cultural roots and the evil external control that is trying to tear these two great peoples apart. But this cultural similarity is part of the reason why the Maidan revolution is such a threat to Russia, which is really what that joke is all about. In fact, it's doubly a threat, because as I'm sure you're aware, many Russians kind of look down on Ukrainians. These Ukrainians, they're these sort of silly peasants and they speak a weird language. But if they manage to westernize, if they manage to be really pull off the reform of their economy, start making their place an attractive place for investment and for people to come and work and return from abroad, not just send remittances. If they can do that, and they're on track to do that, Russians are going to be like, well, if those people can do it, why can't we? And I think this is part of the reason we have to keep in mind whenever Putin does anything, or people like Putin does anything in Ukraine. It's sort of similar to the dynamic between China and Taiwan, in my opinion. The Chinese Communist Party is always telling its people there would be no great China if it wasn't for us. If it wasn't for us, foreigners would control everything, everyone would be poor, China would be absolutely miserable. But then there, right across the strait, is this island that is just as Chinese as the most Chinese part of China. It's just culturally Chinese, and yet they are a world-beating economy. They have culture that is very attractive. Even despite all the pressure that China puts on countries not to have contact with it, it is well known as one of the greatest, most innovative countries in the world. And it's a rebuke. It's a rebuke to communist propaganda and communist ideology.
So in the same way, would you say free Ukraine,
yes,
post Euromaidan is a rebuke to Russia and the tyranny of the regime in Moscow?
Well, rebuke to Putin's regime, yes.
Yeah.
And I think it might even be a glimpse of the future of Russia without Putin.
People could see the possibilities. How, and I've met a few Russians, exiles, especially in Georgia. You don't meet many of those here in Lviv, but I did in Georgia, and so I have very limited experience meeting Russians. I have stories about Russian agents trying to recruit me. That's it for a different topic.
Oh yeah, I want to hear that.
You know that I told you that, right?
I don't think so.
How? Well, the FBI alerted me to it. But we can talk about that later or whenever. Maybe at the end if you bring it up.
I want to hear that podcast.
Yeah, should we do that here or separately? Maybe separately.
Separately.
Yeah, but just because I said it, they informed me, and I became aware of it, and so I was able to avoid it. And but yeah, we will talk about that later. But what do you think? And maybe it's hard for you to have a picture of this, but do you think your average Russian in somewhere in Siberia or the Ural Mountains, has or can access a good idea of what life is like in Ukraine?
I don't know. I haven't been to Russia in ages. They're not necessarily worried about some guy out in the middle of nowhere, Siberia, who only watches Russian news every night. I think they're much more worried about the educated elite. Especially a lot of Russians travel in Europe, do banking in Europe, send their kids to school in Europe. These are the top of Russian society, and these are the ones who will be the drivers for reform and for change when it eventually happens, probably.
Do you think these people buy the story about Putin's sort of conspiracy theory about
hard Ukraine? It's hard to tell. I mean, I haven't seen the poll, but there's a big difference between what people say publicly and what they actually believe. And even if they today buy this story about Ukraine under external control, after several years, it's going to get harder and harder and harder, especially if they meet Ukrainians in Europe and maybe even travel to Ukraine and see that nobody bothers them. They can do what they want. It's going to get harder and harder for them to maintain this idea, maintain their hostility to Ukraine, and maintain their acceptance of their regime.
And that's why I think all the more that your point about even the fact the Ukrainians who speak Russian, that is a huge threat to Putin because they, I mean, I know, for example, I was talking with a friend who's a great trumpet player here, and he's from Dnipro, and his mom was born in Russia, but after 2014, she refused to speak Russian again because she didn't want to give, do her own small part to give. If Putin's only reason for invading was, they speak Russian already, she didn't want to give justification to that. which is very admirable. But at the same time, the biggest, maybe a bigger threat to Putin is Ukrainians who speak Russian, right? I mean,
it's possible. This whole language issue is very contentious in Ukraine, and I don't speak Ukrainian at all, so I can't. I
because you were
often
living
get,
in Kyiv, where it's, I mean,
well, for my thesis, I had to study Russian.
of course,
there weren't that many Ukrainian, and also, I loved going down more of southern Ukraine, down to Odessa, which is a very much still a Russian-speaking city. But
and
yeah,
I'm in Lviv, which is, I mean, this is like the capital of Ukrainian language and culture, the most refined version of the language, perhaps. And although maybe it's Poltava, but that's how Lviv people pride themselves in speaking, lovely Ukrainian, and so we do hear Russian here, though. I mean, when like tons of tourists were here for Christmas, and they speak Russian, and people here know it, and I never once saw hostility. I mean, after the Russian-speaking people would leave, maybe like, my friends who worked at a cafe would kind of snicker, but never to their face. They always spoke, perfectly civilly. I've never seen sort of hostility like that.
And I'll remind you, the language of command for some of these volunteer battalions in the East that helped save Ukraine from a Russian takeover in 2014. These guys spoke to each other in Russian. The commands to stop the Russian mechanized columns came over in Russian. That's fantastic.
Oh, you mean because the effect of?
Well, I mean, it's fantastic that this is not the Maidan Revolution is not a massively sort of nationalist chauvinist project, as it is sometimes depicted in Russian propaganda. It is very broad-based and accepting, and yeah, Ukraine is one of the most tolerant places I've ever been. Sometimes surprisingly so. And the language issue is constantly brought up by Russian propaganda to try to make this look like an ethnic conflict. I must say there are some Ukrainians who also like to bring it up. I sort of explain that they were under repression for an awful long time, so they feel like their day has come, but never violence, never coercion, as far as I can tell, on any of those fronts.
It's very. I'm glad you brought that point up, because it's something that no one, I think, really talks about
Well,
Ukraine.
it kind of goes against the old stereotypes of Ukraine, especially from the 20th century. It's the land of the pogroms, as that's probably a lot of the cultural memory that a lot of Westerners who are the descendants of Ukrainian Jews who fled this region in the early 20th century, late 19th century. This is sort of their final impression. I think it's been totally transformed and changed since then.
What was my maybe last question, and then if there's anything you think we missed, we can discuss. But one idea when people talk about what Putin's motivations are is this, and this sort of like the Kyiv is the, and in fact, there was a video on CNN which I'll send to you, but which made this point without giving some kind of counter argument, but that Kyiv, obviously Kyiv is older than Moscow. Kyiv's Saint Sophia Cathedral is centuries older than Saint Basil's in the Kremlin, for example. It is in a sense more the heart of Slavic Christianity, Slavic spirituality. There is this emotional, sort of mystical significance to Kyiv prior to Moscow. Is there some? Is this just fancy armchair speculation, or do you think, Putin needs Kyiv, in his idea of a new Russia?
Well, they might want it. It'll look nice, but it's an old legitimation thing that rulers of Russia have done for centuries, is to connect themselves to the old rulers of the Kievan Rus down in Kyiv. However, I will remind you, as you can go to Kyiv, and I'll show you the sites where a Mongol army invading the part of the world came in and utterly destroyed Kyiv, leveled it. You can still see some of the ruined churches. That's what they did to Kyiv. What did they do with Moscow? They turned it into their local tax collector. These have very different political origins. And I think they were part of the same empire, but there were many points of divergence, not just that. Also, in Ukraine, it was under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire for a while. And even where you are in Ukraine, as I always need to remind people, where you are was never under the Russian Empire. Lviv was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that's part of the reason why the beer there is so good. But I'm a big fan of beer in Kyiv and Odessa now. Anyway.
Did you ever go to to Uzhgorod on the border with Slovakia?
Never made it there.
The beer there is better than Lviv.
Really?
Yeah, and the coffee.
Those are strong words.
Yeah, it's I love that the cuisine in that city. It's a tiny city. I mean, it's not tiny, but it's maybe 100,000 people. 2 miles from Slovakia, but with a very Hungarian culture, Hungarian Ukrainian, and
if you like, so Uzhgorod is one of the two places I never made it in Ukraine in all my years there that I really wanted to go to. The other one is Kharkiv. Can you talk at all about your trip out there and what you're interested in seeing, and then we can get a report back?
Yeah, thanks, man. That's a good idea, because in just 6.5 hours, I'll be boarding the midnight train from Vauxhall here in the train railway station here in Lviv. I'll take a stop in Kyiv, and then in a couple of days, I will be almost 1,500 kilometers, maybe 1,200 kilometers east of Lviv in the city of Kharkiv, which was briefly the capital of Ukraine in the Soviet days in the 1920s and 30s. It's only about 30 miles, 50 kilometers from the border with Russia. And President Zelensky told the Washington Post a few days ago that, if there is some invasion from Russia, he thinks Kharkiv will be the first target, first stop. I have a lot of friends in Lviv from there. And they come here, they speak Ukrainian, but back home they often speak Russian. So it's a pretty bilingual city. I've never seen it, and this is my chance to see it. And my big motivation to go is in Lviv. As you say, like, we're 70 kilometers from Poland. So for geographical reasons, it's sort of far away from anything that might happen, although we're not so far from Belarus, where Russia also has troops. But I think, secondly, Europe would always want to have some buffer. So I think that they would really try to protect this region. It has historical Polish connections. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So for those reasons, Lviv seems pretty safe. And for the third reason, that people here, as you said, the grandmas in the woods would be ready to fight. And that's the nature of it. It's almost, well, we can go more, be a future discussion as to why this region is that way. But because of that, people are very calm here. Like tonight, before I get on the train, I'm going to go hear some jazz music. And even during the most severe threats from Russia or Corona restrictions, life continues here. And to really have a good picture to tell any stories about Ukraine, I need at least to have a glimpse of Kharkiv and to see what people are like in these days now. Are they afraid? Are they calm? One problem I have with a lot of so what I would call lazy journalism, they go and they just ask people, what do you think about Russia? And then the people are going to think about Russia. I really want to go to Kharkiv and listen and see what people are thinking and talking about, to see how much it's even on their minds. And so I'm going with a colleague, a fellow reporter, and we'll take this sort of trans-Ukraine train and spend a few days in Kharkiv and see what we can learn and see what we can hear.
Well, excellent. I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. And you have to get me a list of the good places, so when I finally make it over there, you can tell me
why was it you wanted to go? What was the?
Oh, for both the historical reasons that you said, as sort of the second city of Ukraine. It's the second biggest city. It's more culturally Russian than Kyiv, and I'd like to take a look at that. But yeah, I had a couple plans to get out there a bunch of times, but I was always short of time or money and never made it out. Shame on me.
Is there any question, if I get to know any Kharkiv people well enough, is there any question you would like to ask?
I would like to know about their experiences in 2014. How crazy did it actually get on the ground? Because I was reading reports and watching webcams, but I don't I don't know anyone from Kharkiv closely, so I haven't been able to find out about that.
Nice. Okay, I will. During that, there was the 2 days of intense.
Well, it was a bit longer than 2 days, but there was 2 days where it was really, really intense. We had Russians supposedly coming over in buses and doing protests, and you had I think actually the first People's Republic of Ukraine was declared in Kharkiv 2 days before it was declared in Donetsk, but I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, these are things I need to learn and to examine. And there's a Ukrainian band, Five Nitsa. They have a song called Soldat. Do you know that?
No, I don't.
I just as we were thinking, all these things are weighing on the mind now of war, and I thought in 2020 when I was here, an American girl that was living here had a party, and there were a lot of our friends were there, and there was a few people from Kyiv, and everyone started to sing this song. It's partly in Russian, partly in Ukrainian. Ya Soldat, I'm a soldier. Almost a little bit sounded like the Killers, but it's a very beautiful song, and everyone was singing it. It's so full of life. And I went back and looked at that video today to think, wow, I mean, even though that was like, during the early days of the pandemic and it was surreal and intense and scary, it seems so innocent and calm now compared to the things we're talking about. Yeah, I'll include that video in this podcast, and that song. But anyway, that's yeah. So I will report back to you, man, and what I've learned. And thanks for the insights.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, man.
I know, man. I wish we could over some beer, and you got to come down to Lviv because it is right now safe. And
thank you very much for the hospitality you extended to me in Lviv just as the lockdown was happening.
Right, that was, I think, almost the day before, a few days before.
Yeah. It's the last chance.
Little did I know I would still be here. What, as we close, what is the one, because everyone is sort of, people are freaking out and worried a bit about this. I mean, a lot Americans have been evacuated, American officials. What is the one thing from this conversation that you think we really should remember that maybe everyone's sort of missing? And then one in just a couple sentences.
I think that we need to realize how much Putin and Putin's people might be driven by fear, not of NATO, not of the EU, of a free Ukraine. And that, I tend to believe that is his ultimate target. It's not some new European security structure. It's not NATO going back to its, like, those would be nice, if you can get them, it's nice, but I think those are mostly distractions for what's really going on this winter.
Wow. Well, Andrew Fink, thank you, man.
All right, have a good one.
Yeah, do побачення. I don't remember Russian because I've been in Lviv. Papa, what do they say?
Пока, or до свидания.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and you can find more information and other podcasts at lvivlab.com. That's LVIVLAB.com. Thank you very much, and signing out this episode from Kyiv, Ukraine. This is Joe Lindsley. Thank you.
Скрыть